Hello, literacy leaders and champions. Welcome to Literacy Talks. We are so excited to welcome you to this podcast series from Reading Horizons, dedicated to exploring the ideas, trends, insights, and practical issues that will help us all improve our professional practice in teaching reading. Our series host is Stacy Hurst, professor at Southern Utah University and chief academic officer at Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Joining Stacy are Donnell Pons, a recognized expert in literacy and special education, and Lindsay Kemeny, a Utah-based elementary classroom teacher. Today's topic is MTSS, multi-tiered systems of support. Let's get started.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Literacy Talks, where we talk about all kinds of things related to literacy. And today is no exception. I'm joined by my co-hosts, Lindsay Kemeny and Donnell Pons. And today we are going to talk about something that should impact everyone. And we're going to let Lindsay lead this discussion. So we'll just turn the time right over to you, Lindsay, so we can get right to it.
All right. Yes, we're going to talk about MTSS, which stands for Multi-Tier System of Supports. And I would like to just start with, let's explain what this is. Let's give a definition. It could be your own definition or one you came up with, and you guys can just fight over who wants to go first.
Let's go in alphabetical order. Who would that be? Oh, Donnell.
All right, Donnell, what is MTSS?
You know, it's interesting because you almost can't talk about MTSS with educators unless you mention RTI, because they've almost become synonymous, even though they aren't the same thing, which is interesting. I know, Lindsay, you'll get into that later, but in giving that definition of MTSS, it's the larger framework that encompasses behavior as well as academics. And so if you think of it as the bigger umbrella, and then within the inside of that is the RTI, MTSS also includes not just supports and systems for students, but also for teachers to receive additional training and things. So that's MTSS encompasses those things. It's kind of interesting because when I worked in schools, inevitably, teachers would tell me the two things were the very same thing. I wonder if the two of you have had that same experience.
Yeah, actually, I wrote a blog post about this in 2014 and actually saw it cited in two places recently. And one of them was on Keys to Literacy website. So I revisited that blog post and it was the whole title was, "What is the difference between RTI and MTSS?" So I think those two terms were used synonymously when we started applying this model to education specifically for reading, and it needed clarification. So my experience, RTI stands for response and prevention, although a lot of us started referring to it as response to instruction. But also MTSS, like you said, Donnell, is just more comprehensive, and it includes another acronym because we love those in education, that we refer to as PBIS, which are positive behavioral supports. And so it is a more comprehensive, academic and behavioral and systemic. I felt like RTI could take place within a classroom, within a grade level, within a school. MTS is very much systems beyond that. So also district and hopefully state level supports as well.
So that's when I was kind of reading online, those are the main differences I saw. Like, yes, it's a larger framework. It includes behavior and other things, more of a system. I'm talking about MTSS. And beyond that, in articles, like my eyes started to glaze over a little bit and I'm like, wait, what? So what else? Do you think that's just the main difference, or is there anything else important that you would add about the difference between MTSS and RTI?
I mean, when we say, is that just, it's a lot of just, right? Is that just the difference? That's a lot of just. Okay. So to give an example, in the school, I'm just going to give an example of one of the schools that I taught in. When I arrived, we had a serious issue with challenges across the board. It was a K through 12 charter. And we were trying to address academics. It was really looking at reading, but then we had a whole behavior issue that was going on as well. So in our setting, when we sat down as a team, we brought in a bunch of teachers, general, special education. We also had some speech language. You should see a lot of folks at the table when you're putting the structure together and discuss the needs of the school, our students within the school, than what we had as our resources at the school. And really, you're looking at your situation and your students when you're talking about what can we do here and what do we need. And we decided that we really needed an MTSS framework. We'd been talking RTI, but what we really needed was MTSS. And so that's really the beginning. And I've noticed in a lot of the materials that I've researched too this past week to get a fresher view on what's happening, a lot of them begin right there with, you need to sit down and discuss as a school, what are the needs of our students? What are our resources? And then talk about how those two systems might work together, one or both. You usually have RTI involved within your MTSS.
Yeah, I like that, Donnell.
Sorry, MTS is a little more comprehensive. I think the main difference is maybe not necessarily a difference, but a heightened level of support. So it's just more support in a lot of different ways. And I did sense, having been an educator who's experienced RTI and MTSS, that there is more of a focus on prevention with the MTSS model than there was RTI, though that was also there. I mean, nobody wants students to fail. At the heart, it's all about supporting students and teachers, students mostly, and that increases when we're talking about a more comprehensive, systematic support system.
I love that. A system of supports. And how can we support teachers in the classroom at the classroom level? And then how can we support at the building level? And then maybe at the district level? And it takes everyone kind of pitching in to make this work well. So I want to talk about the different tiers, and let's talk about what those look like. And we'll start with tier 1. What does tier 1 look like? What does that mean to you when they're saying MTSS and tier 1? What thoughts do you have?
Yeah, if I could just say a few things before I get to the heart of that answer too. I like thinking of MTSS as a framework, and those tiers are part of that framework. I think it keeps us safe from things like initiative fatigue. It's the thing that stays constant. And we know within each of those tiers of support, and we're talking instructional supports, right? When we're talking about those tiers, that programs can change, teacher knowledge can improve, but that framework stays. And so I think it's important as educators for us to understand that and work within that framework to help support our students. So when I think of tier 1 instruction, I feel like, and Donnell and I were talking about this earlier today, I think that that's our best effort right there. It is a preventative, right? That tier 1 instruction needs to be the best that it can be.
I love the phrase, you can't intervene your way out of a tier 1 problem, right? We have to have a good, solid tier 1. That's going to make sure that the rest of the tiers are a little smaller. We want our students supported well in tier 1.
Yeah, so the support required would be less, right, in the tiers 2 and 3.
So just talking about that tier 1 and really excellent support, in looking at some of the materials that I said I was looking at online, especially from the International Dyslexia Association, they've had several presentations by different schools that have really tackled this. And I really liked some of the materials I saw. They went right down to percentages they wanted to see in each tier. If we're doing our job, our percentages should look like this. I thought that was really interesting because we're also, another piece to this is data. So a big piece of RTI, MTSS is data, right? It's data driven in order to see, are we getting to where we want to be? Also, are we finding all of the students who need to be receiving services or support, right, through our system? So data is a really big piece of it. But I thought it was really interesting to see that this school had actually honed in on, this is the percentage of students who really, if we're doing our job correctly, we should only have this many students who are needing to move forward. I think that's very important too, as our vision and goal of where we want to be. This is where we are. We know we can do better. Where would we like to be? And our data is going to help get us there because it's going to be telling us how it's going with our students. And then that other piece, Lindsay, about you talking about that tier 1 in the classroom, really excellent instruction. I had the opportunity, it was at that same school where we really had to be creative and responsive about helping students because we had a lot of needs. And one of the things I think in the end that was so helpful is we had a lot of individuals who were providing services in different settings and in small group and pulling students for different things. But really, when we all communicated, we dedicated time. That's another piece that I'm seeing is critical to the schools that are really implementing well, is there are dedicated times for the groups to get together, groups of teachers to discuss what's happening in their teaching experiences across those tiers. And they're sharing information about students. That's another key piece. And things really turned around for us in my setting. I know when we were meeting with the general classroom teacher and we were sharing insights about students, thoughts on instruction, and we were using similar enough materials to help each other. And I'll tell you, our whole classroom teacher, the general teacher in that classroom, was so grateful and appreciative and really felt part of, she said, for the first time in her teaching career, part of a team, she called it. So I think that's some of the good things that happen.
Yeah, I love, Donnell, that you brought up data, and I was trying to decide, when to bring this into our conversation, but assessment and data is definitely a huge piece of this. And if you have a large amount of your students where if you look at your data and a lot of them aren't, making good progress or aren't reaching benchmark, then you have a tier 1 problem. And it can be hard. You have to try to separate yourself from what's happening, right? Because it might not be you. It might be the program you're using or something. But if you have this, if you're in January and you have a large percentage of your students are below benchmark or not making good progress, then you have to say, okay, I've got to change what I'm doing. Tier 1. And at the beginning of the year, this year, I had over half of my students were below benchmark. And so how do you do tier 2 with 12, 13 students? So that's when I knew, okay, I've got to make sure my tier 1 is really strong. And I implemented a class-wide intervention that I had learned about. And I needed intervention for everybody. So it's important. Let's go to tier 2 then. What is tier 2? What does that mean?
Well, if I could just comment on what you just said too, Lindsay, I think an important aspect of tier 1 instruction is differentiation. That is not up to somebody outside of the classroom, although certainly people outside of the classroom can help with that. But that is generally the classroom teacher's opportunity to help differentiate for each student. And I know that as a teacher myself, that's when I really felt like I was teaching. I know there's a lot of impact when you're doing whole class instruction, but it's easy to differentiate in a whole class setting, especially if you're in a state like ours. We have really big class sizes. And so you have a lot of things to keep in mind at once. But that differentiation piece is really important. I was lucky early in my career as a literacy coach. We implemented RTI at the time and MTSS later in our school. And some of those things that we're talking about between the tiers, that is what's really important about MTSS. This is not only data-driven, but team-driven. And so we don't want to talk about these tiers in isolation, right? Like we're communicating across those tiers with people that will be involved in providing support for those students. And I think that's an important element of tier 2 instruction. What are the words that we usually hear associated with that? Targeted and strategic. And so it's just a little more focused on exactly what those students need to move them along. Also important to note, to not label the students by tier, right?
Yes.
He's tier 1 student, he's a tier 2 student. No, we're talking about instruction. Anytime we say tier, we're talking about instruction, not kids.
Yeah, I love that. And everyone is serviced in tier 1, right? We can't just say, oh, this is a tier 3 student and I'm not going to worry about him because the special ed teacher teaches him or whatever. That's one of my pet peeves, right? Donnell?
Lindsay, I'm going to jump right in there with you because this is another thing I see happening is when we do apply a label and we suddenly say, oh, now that's a tier 2 kid, what I see happening is now that student isn't getting their tier 1 instruction in addition to their tier 2. So remember, the dosing is important here. I'm entitled as a student to my tier 1 and my tier 2, not just tier 2 and pull me out during my tier 1, right? Like you were saying, Lindsay. So that's important, is to remember that I'm a part of the tier 1 classroom too, folks, and I'm getting my tier 2 instruction. If I need, I'll be getting tier 3. The other thing is also, this is fluid. So that's another thing too, is remember, just because I need tier 2 for this particular thing that I'm learning or this particular moment, doesn't mean I'm going to be in tier 2 for a lot of other things, or I may need tier 3 for this thing and back down to tier. So again, this should be fluid. It works for the student. Stacey, you had a comment.
So I have the opportunity to teach this to my pre-service teachers, to teach the MTSS model. And I know that various schools and districts across the country are in different stages of implementing this. I continue to be surprised how many schools are not or are only beginning it, right? So I always do that with hesitation. This is what you should see. It might be functioning differently. But when we're talking about that very important piece, that they're layers for a reason, those tiers are layered on each other. They're not in place of. And so one of the books that I used to help prepare for my class this year, I recommend it. I think the copyright was 2016, but it's called Integrated Multi-Tiered Systems of Support, but the focus is on blending RTI and PBIS. So it's really been valuable information for me to add to what I know and refine what I know about MTSS. But I loved this. They are comparing actually this model generated out of the medical world. So I find that interesting. So you have all kinds of examples with that. So what we're talking about right now, this says on page 15 of that book, for example, we would never tell elderly patients that when they receive a flu shot, they can stop washing their hands. That makes perfect sense when we're talking about students shouldn't have to stop washing their hands or getting that tier 1 instruction because they got a flu shot or they're getting a little more targeted instruction.
Great. But yes, absolutely. Those students really should be getting a double dose.
As literacy educators, we work to apply the very best, most effective instructional practices in our classrooms. Multi-tiered Systems of Support, or MTSS, is a framework that supports our work and student success. For more information, visit readinghorizons.com/reading resources. And while you're there, we invite you to dive into other topics from our Literacy Talks podcast series.
If there's one thing that I want someone to take away from this, if they see that happening at their school, that's something we should really intervene on, because that's the most egregious thing that I see happening when I visit schools or when I work with students who maybe have an IEP or maybe they're in tiered, and I find out that they're getting very little actual classroom instruction of tier 1 instruction. They're probably receiving the least amount of instruction than all of the students, and they need the most. So I would say it's so important.
Yeah. And, Donnell, you've had experience with this in a school setting, as have I. And it is easy for us to say, this is what should be happening. But anybody who has had to manage, deal with, juggle schedules know how hard it is to make sure that that happens. That's one reason it is so important that we prioritize literacy instruction, especially in those early grades, in a way that we can provide that support for the students and for the teachers who need help delivering that support. So it's not as easy as it sounds. We recognize that. I think we all recognize that. But what I see happening, especially when we're talking about integrating behavior into this model, which is critical because all of that impacts the way a student learns. I've seen so many times that teachers or schools will just say, well, tier 3 instruction or tier 2 instruction that happens outside of the classroom, we're just going to do that during art. And so the student who needs that kind of instruction will just miss art. And, art is not as important to life, is what they think or how they rationalize it. There's just no other time. But I've seen the impact that has on kids who miss art. And by the way, a lot of these kids, it's where they shine. And so we're taking away the very part of the day that they just love. I feel like it's really important that we allow for that.
I'm going to tag onto this too, because, and this is where my heart is, right? It's right here in this subject. So I've got a few things to say on it. And it's where a lot of the people that I love in my life have spent their time in their education system. And it wasn't well spent for a lot of them. And that's why I'm so passionate about this, is because it's so very important to do it and do it well. And it can make such a big difference in a student's life. So I think some big key takeaways, and I'm hearing Stacey say this too, and I just want to reiterate because they're important, is one, making sure that the students are receiving the best instruction when they're in that particular grade. Like those early years, K through 3, when we hit literacy, it doesn't get easier to provide that really great instruction later. It only gets harder because students have more demands on their time. The other key piece is it is much easier to provide that too when students have that time in one classroom versus then options for art and other things that should be adding to the curriculum. It becomes even more difficult, and we don't want to take those opportunities away from students because they need those as well. That's so important. And then another key piece that I see happen as well, when students are receiving services through an RTI model, say they're in a tiered system of support, then realize that there's a lot of demands on their time too, that student's time. So maybe there are assignments or things that have been given in tier 1 that because the student has now been moved into a tier 2 or a 3 setting and they're having other instruction, they may not be able to finish as much of. So the quality of that work versus the quantity of that work becomes important, so that student isn't denied additional activities. Like, we're all going out on a special trip, but you didn't finish, so you can't go. We need to be mindful that they're receiving additional instruction, which may take away from the time they have to complete an assignment. So quality over quantity for those students who are receiving additional instruction, I think, is important too.
Absolutely. So important to adjust sometimes the workload and to realize how much those students are working. And Stacey, you brought up, like, this is such a scheduling problem. It's a challenge, definitely, because the students that are being pulled out for, say, tier 3 instruction, because they have to miss something. So we don't want them to miss, our good quality tier 1 instruction. We don't want them to miss science or social studies. We don't want them to miss art or PE. So when do you pull them? That can be really tricky. In my classroom right now, it works out pretty well because I have kind of a intervention block where the students are doing, different activities and I'm pulling small group. It's also when our special education teacher pulls groups, but I make that time a little bit longer so that they're in the classroom and I can pull them as well. So they're kind of getting a double dose of intervention there, and then they're not missing the tier 1 instruction. But I can definitely realize that that's one of the hardest things as a classroom teacher, to manage what they're going to be missing, because we don't just waste time. Most of us in the classroom, we have a lot of important things to be doing.
Yeah, I think that speaks to where we want to go with this kind of a model, right? Because I know there's been a lot said. MTSS has been known about for a couple decades now, probably. And I know a few years back, there was a report that I guess people got from the data that it wasn't effective. But I can tell you from experience that it's not the model that's not working. It's what we're doing with our instruction. So when we're talking about all of these challenges, which really come down to time and people probably, but when we're looking at that, if our tier 1 instruction, everything hinges on that. If we give them the best shot out of the gate, then that frees up the resources that we normally use in tier 2 and tier 3 instruction. And some schools have tier 4 that will help us be more targeted, more intentional, and less of a drag and a pull on the other resources. One thing when we're talking about time, not only time for instruction, for targeted instruction, but that data piece can't be overlooked. And when we implemented MTSS in my school, we had a grant. We wrote a grant where we had enough time in the school day that as a literacy coach, I met with each teacher once a week. It happened to be when their students were at library, and I had a room right off the library, and they came and met with me, and we went over data and we talked about those kids and we talked about what they needed. And that's where we were able to organize it. But I will tell you, because we had really great instructional interventions in tiers 2 and 3, our tier 2 and 3 students were outpacing the general classroom students until we fixed the instruction in that tier. That's why we have terms like, we'll use the word science when we're talking about reading instruction, because it has to be aligned with what we know works. And when that works, the model will work for us.
Absolutely. Okay, so we talked about tier 1 and 2, but not so much about tier 3. So how would you define tier 3 and how is that different than the others?
So I think a simplistic way to define that is to think about, again, the words that we use in each of those tiers. In tier 1, we often hear the term universal, so everyone. Tier 3, it's a lot more individualized. And with tier 2, in between, a lot of that kind of instruction, tier 2 instruction, can be delivered in smaller groups or small groups. And I think of tier 3, when I think of tier 3, I think it's individualized. And some students need a lot more intensive instruction.
And Stacey, we're probably monitoring those students even more. So we're checking in more often to make sure, is this instruction headed in the right direction, right? So I also think of that where not only the instruction is more intensive, but also our monitoring of that instruction to make sure we're heading in the right direction.
Goes back to assessment and data. Right?
Yep.
If we were going to offer up some steps to take to implement MTSS, I think we kind of already talked about how, number one, you've got to have a strong tier 1. And so, we've got to train our teachers, have a solid program, to support our teachers. And then my opinion, number 2 would be identifying those that are struggling readers or maybe have the potential. And I think for that, you need a really good screener. Would you guys agree, or what's your next step, you would say?
Well, assessment drives the whole model, right? So we know with MTSS, we have universal screeners. There's that word universal again. We have diagnostic assessment. For those kiddos who don't score well on the screener, we administer diagnostic to figure out how we can target our instruction. And then we monitor the progress of that. And then, of course, our outcome assessment, usually at the end of the year. I heard the term autopsy report before, and I just stick with that because that's the end of level testing that once you get the results, they've moved on to the next grade. But all of that plays into how we make those decisions, right?
Absolutely. So we need that screener to kind of see who's at risk and maybe who we need to really keep our eye on. And then that diagnostic that Stacey's talking about is going to kind of dive in, because a screener doesn't necessarily tell you what specific weaknesses the student has. So then you want to do a diagnostic and find out where, exactly what is going on with the student. Where's their weakness? And I love that you brought up progress monitoring, because that is so important to monitor. And I don't like to think of it as how the student is doing, but I kind of think of it more as how my instruction is going for this student. And if they're making good growth, then you're like, awesome, it's working. If they're not, okay, we need to change something because something's not working.
Yeah, back to the term response to intervention, the student response to intervention.
I know a lot of times people ask, well, how often should you progress monitor? And one thing I was thinking about is that it really doesn't matter if you don't look at the data. So you need to look at what's happening. If you're not going to change anything because of the results, then you might as well not be doing the assessment. So we have to make sure that we look and then we change things. And I had that, last year I had a student where we did, our middle of the year, and he was showing below average growth. Now, everyone else in my class was typical, above, or well above. So I knew tier 1 was good. It was okay. But everything I was doing for this child wasn't working. So I knew I had to change something. And so with him, I found out I just had to really pull him back by himself, because he had such a hard time being distracted in the group and different things, and maybe concerned what the other kids were doing. Once I started pulling him back by himself, then he got on that better trajectory and wasn't below growth anymore. By the end of the year, he was above growth. But that's like what you have to do, is kind of figure out, what do I have to change? Something's not working.
Yeah. And when we're talking about implementing this model, I think that we have a lot of room for improvement when we're talking about how to analyze data and just about assessment in general. Because like you said, Lindsay, if we're not looking at it and we don't know how to look at it and how to interpret it, it could end up frustrating us. If we know those things, we make better informed decisions that will end up helping our student. I know when we were doing Dibbles, and we were just trying a lot of things, but at one point we were progress monitoring those kiddos every week. And that's good because you have a lot of data points, and it's 1 minute. So it's not like, it's going to upend everything. But from week to week, I'd have teachers who were calling their therapists, because they went down this week by 2 words per minute, but really we had to say, we're just gathering data. We want to look at the overall trajectory, not that week. You're not on that week to week roller coaster. There are a lot of things we could learn more about. I know I still have a lot to learn with that.
And I think it can be easy to kind of tie maybe how we feel about ourselves with how our students are doing. And it's so hard, but we've really got to separate that as a teacher and really just look at it objectively. And it's just not happening for this student.
I got it now, Lindsay. Thank you for coming back to me, because it was a thought about the student. Again, it's about understanding the student. And you explained what you did in a classroom with your student, which is textbook. I love the explanation you gave, and that's a textbook explanation, that you understood the needs of that student. So that is the other piece of RTI, MTSS, is we really are looking at the individual needs of the student. So that does mean that when there's a student who needs something different, we're going to look at it. We're going to examine that. And remember that equal is not always fair. So the students always say, well, is that fair if so-and-so gets this much time? But right now for that student, that's what's needed. It's not always equal. And I think that's, I had a good teacher one time explain, if I had a student pass out at the front of my class and I have to go to that student to make sure they're okay, everybody else is going to have to wait. And that's not fair. It's not equal. But what's fair right now for this student is I'm up there and helping that student. That's what that student needs. And so oftentimes we have to look at it that way, is that somebody's going to have different needs at different times. And maybe for reading, this particular student's going to need more help right here. But maybe we enter art class and that student is rocking, right? And everybody else is going to be needing a little support in order to be able to do what that student's able to do. And maybe we step into science class and now the student who wasn't so great in art class is doing really well. So again, this will move around throughout the day, throughout the year as the student grows. It can change and develop that way, understanding the needs of our students.
So related to that and what Lindsay just said too, I know as teachers, our hearts are in what we do. And it's not an easy thing to not take that data personally for whatever reason. So Lindsay, you're the one currently in the seat where you are seeing data, you're doing the thing in a second grade classroom. How would you advise teachers to do that? To look at the data a little bit more objectively? What works for you?
Oh, that is hard because it's kind of a mind shift. I feel like you've got to really try to separate yourself and just say, it's like that one little boy. I was teaching him and he was below progress. He was making below average progress. And I just had to say, okay, what I'm doing is not working for him. It's working for other students. It's not working for him. So I'm going to change something so that it works for him. It's hard. You've just got to try to separate it somehow.
I think partly the reason I ask too is because of my experience as a literacy coach. And I always had to be very aware when I was having data conversations with teachers. It's not just numbers, right? These represent kids and it represents somebody's life's work. It's in their mind an evaluation of them and their teaching. So I ask that because I think that it would be really fantastic if we could find a way. Because in my mind, just so those teachers know, I was never looking at that data and saying, that teacher is a terrible teacher. What is she even doing here? I really was looking at it with that investigative, like, okay, this group of kids, what do they need, right? But I think oftentimes the teachers, no matter what I said or did, they thought I was judging them as a professional. And I think even if you didn't have a person in the room talking about the numbers, if they just look at the data, they might think they were being judged by that.
Stacey, I don't think there's anything any one of us can say that's going to alleviate this for everybody. It might hit right with somebody, but there'll be somebody else who says, yeah, but it still really hurts. I look at that data and I don't feel very good about it, or it makes me feel this way. I don't want anybody else seeing the data, or I know what my peers are thinking. And I think that's just part of who we are, right? And especially as educators, none of us got into this not to do a fantastic job. I mean, we know that we're involved in people's lives. That's what we love about it. And we know that we have the potential to really help people live better lives. And we love thinking about our students, where they'll be in the next 5 to 10 years. I love looking down the road for my students and even hearing from them years later. There's nothing better than hearing them be successful. So that does hurt, because in that moment, you're feeling like all of that has come to a stop, right? I'm not doing it. But what's so great to remember as educators is that we do have what you need. That's the other piece to this. Maybe 15, 20 years ago, it was hard to find this information. But the great thing is today, I'm going to find what I need. There somewhere somebody's got it, particularly in reading. We have so many more advances and things available to teachers. So that's the good news, I think.
There's a lot of information out there and there's supports out there. So yeah, this has been a great conversation. And I hope this has given everyone listening just a few ideas and maybe things to think about as we're implementing these different frameworks in the classroom. So thanks, you guys.
And I hope those of you listening really listen to what Donnell said at the end, even though she didn't provide us with a bumper sticker solution about how to not take that data like personally. please know that we're here to support you. So feel free to reach out. And we don't have all the answers, unfortunately, but we know people who do, and we know some resources. So I hope that whatever setting you're in, that you're feeling supported with the type of training that you're receiving as a teacher and the type of instruction you're able to deliver. The instructional materials, right? Those need to be very useful for you as well. So thanks for this conversation today. I think the very unifying thing is that we all have our students in our minds and our hearts. Okay, well, thank you all for joining us. We will see you next time on Literacy Talks.
Thanks for joining us today for Literacy Talks, the podcast series for literacy leaders and champions everywhere. Literacy Talks comes to you from Reading Horizons, where reading momentum begins. Join us next time.